Warriors Don't Cry, Melba, Patillo, Beals, Chapter 11. On some days I found myself thinking every waking moment about nothing else but my safety, consumed with learning skills that would keep me alive. When would someone get the best of me, and how could I head them off? By October 11th, I had made myself ill with what appeared to be the flu. That Friday, I stayed home from Central and snuggled down into my bed where it was safe. I was well aware that my illness was more sadness and exhaustion than flu. I knew I had to get myself together because the next day I was supposed to meet with some of the 8 others and some hardcore segregationist student leaders for a discussion that might lead to an understanding. To ensure my speedy recovery, Grandma came after me with castor oil. I protested, but I knew it was no use. "It's too bad you have to miss a day of school." Mother Lois fluffed my pillows and tightened the sheet at the bottom of my bed. Dressed in her tan gabardine teaching suit with black blouse, she was off to school. "Let's hope you'll be well enough to attend tomorrow." I knew very well I would have to force myself to attend. It would be the first time ever that segregationist student leaders would be coming to talk with us, integrating students in a reasonably safe place where we all could speak our minds. It was sponsored by a Norwegian reporter, Mrs. Joram Ricketts, who had set it up with Ernie, Minnie Jean, and me, and the group spotlighted as staunch troublemakers, Sammy Dean Parker, Kay Bacon, and their crowd. Sammy Dean Parker had been seen in the newspaper embracing Governor Faubus as she thanked him for keeping us out of school. People referred to the meeting as a possible turning point, a time of coming together. I had thought about nothing else for several days. I even dreamed that we would go to the meeting, and afterward things would calm down considerably at school. It was that hope that made me drag myself out of bed on Saturday morning and head for the parish hall of St. Andrew's Cathedral. Upon arrival, I learned the meeting would be reported by the National Broadcasting Company for future use on a network radio show. I hoped that wouldn't change our being able to speak our minds. The meeting room was a stark white setting with mahogany straight-back chairs. It was the kind of place that could well inspire a deep, honest talk that might help us get along with one another. Mrs. Ricketts, a woman of medium stature with blonde hair pulled to the nape of her neck, began asking questions. Joseph Fox, labeled a central moderate because he didn't violently oppose our presence, said, "I lay the whole blame for this thing in Governor Faubus's lap. We wouldn't have had nearly so much trouble if he hadn't called out the National Guard." "That's not so. I think our governor is trying to protect all of us," said Sammy Dean Parker. "He said we'd have to integrate, but he has to prepare us." Ernie said, "All we want is an education and to be able to go to school and back home safely." When Mrs. Ricketts asked why some of the white children objected to going to school with us, Sammy Dean replied, "Well, it's racial, marrying each other." "School isn't a marriage bureau," Ernie said. "We don't have to socialize," I said. Kay Bacon said she had heard rumors that we wanted to rule over them. "I don't think you know much about our people. I don't think you ever tried to find out," Minnie Jean said. Kay admitted she hadn't tried to understand much about us until that meeting. "We're scared to death 500 of you all are going to be coming into school," Sammy Dean said. The white students also expressed their feelings about the troops. Several times they spoke of their outrage at having soldiers in their school. "How do you think we like being escorted in and out of school?" I said. "How do you think we like not knowing who will hit us and when or where we'll be attacked?" Later in the New York Times, Sammy Dean Parker and Kay Bacon said that as a result of the meeting they now had a new attitude. One headline in the Gazette read, "Two pupils tell of change in attitude on segregation." Sammy Dean Parker was quoted as saying, "The Negro students don't want to go to school with us any more than we want to go to school with them. If you really talk with them, you'll see their side of it. I think the NAACP is paying them to go." When I read her statement, I realized Sammy hadn't understood at all our reason for attending Central High. I wondered where on earth she thought there was enough money to pay for such brutal days as I was enduring. I wouldn't know how much money to charge for all the good days I wasn't having in my old high school with friends who liked me. What price could anyone set for the joy and laughter and peace of mind I had given up? By the time I returned to school on Wednesday, things had deteriorated. The headlines that day read, 101st Division cut back force today, 1/2 going back to Kentucky. Until that time, when soldiers were taken away, it was only to Camp Robinson, a stone's throw away. The announcement of their departure to Kentucky gave segregationists reason to celebrate, and it was evident in the students who bragged about their renewed hope of getting rid of us. As I stepped into the hallway, just for an instant, the thought of fewer troops terrified me. But the warrior growing inside me squared my shoulders and put my mind on alert to do whatever was necessary to survive. I tried hard to remember everything Danny had taught me. I discovered I wasn't frightened in the old way anymore. Instead, I felt my body muscles turn steely and my mind strained to focus. I had to take care of myself. I could really depend only on myself for protection. A new voice in my head spoke to me with military-like discipline. Discover ink sprayed on the contents of your locker? Don't fret about it. Deal with it. Get another locker assigned, find new books, get going. Don't waste time brooding or taking the hurt so deep inside. Kicked in the shin, tripped on the marble floor, assess the damage, and do whatever is necessary to remain mobile. Move out. Warriors keep moving. They don't stop to lick their wounds or cry. By mid-October, there were fewer and fewer 101st Guards and fewer Arkansas National Guardsmen. We quickly learned the presence of the 101st had lulled us into a false sense of security. The segregationist students were just biding their time until they could make their move. As the Guards were reduced in number, our attackers revved up a full campaign against us. The less visible the 101st, the more we suffered physical and verbal abuse. On Monday, October 28th, Mrs. Huckabee notified us in writing that we were to contact our parents to come to a meeting in School Superintendent Blossom's office downtown at 4:45 p.m. That last-minute request meant Mother Lois had to rush over from her teaching job in North Little Rock, but it was necessary because we all hoped that meeting would signal the beginning of the school officials' willingness to do something about the incredible increase in attacks against us. I couldn't imagine what else they'd want to discuss. As we climbed the stairs with our parents to the meeting in Superintendent Blossom's office, we all had one thing on our minds. The school officials provide a concrete plan to stop the abuse by Central High's hardcore segregationist students. 30 minutes into that meeting, neither Blossom nor any of his people had addressed the issue we had told him we were anxious to discuss. Instead, all the school officials present were giving us the same song and dance about our not responding to our attackers in order to maintain peace. They were lecturing us on the proper attitude and the responsibility of our parents. There were no words from them about how they were going to take any responsibility for keeping students from abusing us. "Excuse me," Mother Lois said, suddenly rising to her feet, interrupting Superintendent Blossom mid-sentence. I was frightened to see her standing there so tiny, wringing her hands nervously. "What I want to know is whether or not you have any specific plans for protecting our children." "That's none of your business," Blossom replied in a rude tone. "Oh, I'd say it's very much my business." Mother's words came rapid fire. Still, he ignored her, continuing his rhetoric as before. Silence fell over the room. She interrupted him once more. "As parents, we have a right to know how you will protect our children." Blossom continued his meaningless comments, ignoring her as she stood there for several minutes expecting him to answer her. Finally, she took her seat. Her face was red with anger and embarrassment. I felt that by disrespecting Mother that way, the superintendent was disrespecting all of us seated in that room. I was very angry with the others, especially the fathers, who did not stand up to defend my mother. The humiliation and fear I felt so upset me that I couldn't consider anything that was said during the remainder of the meeting. Nevertheless, it was clear by the time we left for home that nothing had been resolved. On one of the first days of November, Minnie Jean arrived at my house after school to show me Life magazine. It had a full-size picture of my back in it. There I was, ponytail and all, saluting the flag. It wasn't the first time we'd seen ourselves in print or on television, but we giggled at the wonder of it all. Miss Minnie Jean and Miss Melba could now be seen on the pages of Life, Look, or the New York Times. As Minnie Jean and I spent time together that evening, I could tell she was beginning to be deeply affected by what was being done to her at Central High. She seemed especially vulnerable to the isolation we were all struggling to cope with. She had decided she would be accepted by white students if she could just show them how beautifully she sang. She was almost obsessed with finding an opportunity to perform her music on stage. She said she was definitely going to participate in a school program and had in fact already made inquiries about it. Little did we know that even while we were discussing her performance in school programs, the Central High Mothers League was preparing to make a bigger fuss than ever before to exclude her. But their threats did not stop Minnie Jean. I wondered whether or not she had considered that the audience would boo her off the stage. Did she figure they would be enraptured by her performance? I shuddered at the thought of what the students would say or do to her if she made it. When I talked to Ernie about my concerns, he brushed them aside. As usual, he was taking the situation in stride. Even when he was punched with punishing blows or was kicked to the floor, he kept a positive attitude. I liked his attitude even when I didn't agree with his view. Like me, Thelma was very concerned about Minnie Jean. We talked about how we could convince her to stop pushing to participate. Each of us was hearing increasingly negative responses to her desire to do so. It was clear to us that both students and outsiders would take the opportunity to make a huge issue of her request. Terry was philosophical about it. Let her try and she'll learn her lesson, once and for all. I could see Terry was becoming more fatalistic about our predicament. His hopes that we could change people's minds were visibly reduced. He was nervous, not as cheerful, not humming his funny tunes. Stress was beginning to tell on Gloria, too. She was clamming up, becoming solemn. I could almost see her mind working to try to set things right so she could keep going in her meticulous way. Elizabeth had never fully regained her composure following her awful encounter with the mob. Continued harassment was also taking its toll of her. She reacted by becoming silent and withdrawn. When I discussed Minnie Jean's predicament with Elizabeth, she appeared alarmed and agreed that we ought not attract unnecessary attention to ourselves. Carlotta strained to keep smiling. Although she often took a lot of heat, especially in gym class, she tried to make the best of it, as did Jeff. Like the two other boys, Jeff was taking a lot of brutal physical punishment. He was quick on his feet, but he often got trapped in gym class or in corners of the hall where he was kicked and punched. Whenever we compared notes, we all agreed. The students' attitudes had become polarized. We felt it would be best for Minnie Jean to back off, but none of us could talk her out of it. She was adamant. The more we pleaded, the more determined she seemed to become. Only during fleeting moments did I allow myself to have fantasies of what it might be like to sing with the chorus or perform in the Thanksgiving program. My hopes of being a part of normal activities had long since faded. I refused to set myself up for disappointment. I simply wanted to make it through the year alive and uninjured. I resigned myself to devoting all my energy to that goal. I was surprised when I was invited to speak to the students who attended chapel, a fairly safe corner of the school. It had been the one place where I had found brief moments of peace on those days when I arrived early enough to go there. I agonized over the invitation, but finally Grandma made it easy for me. This is your opportunity to witness. But what if they throw things? In the house of the Lord? Surely not. These white folks aren't heathens. While you speak, they will come to understand you are all worshiping the same Lord. So I prepared my talk, but I kept my invitation to myself. I didn't want to hurt Minnie Jean's feelings, given the heroic effort she was making to convince school officials to allow her to sing on stage. It was our tradition each year to sort through our toys and clothing at Thanksgiving and to give away all the things we didn't need or use, as well as two things dear to us that we would especially like to keep. Conrad, have you got that train boxed yet? Not yet, Grandma. When, Conrad? Mother said as she dried the dinner dishes and handed them to me to put away. She and Grandma had been trying all day to get Conrad to see things their way. Melba's giving away her favorite blouse, Grandma said, and she's donating her favorite cord skirt and a pair of shoes. She glanced at Conrad to see whether or not her prodding was affecting his stingy attitude. Melba likes suffering and doing without. That's why she goes to Central. But why do I have to? Where did you get a notion like that about your sister? Clark said that's what his folks say because Sis stays in that white school, being mistreated every day. Her staying there means she has made a promise that she intends to keep, because she told God she would, and she doesn't want to let herself and God down, Mother Lois said, walking over to look Conrad in the eye. So you must explain that to Clark the next time he inquires about your sister's motives. Yes, ma'am, but I'm not giving up the train. It's mine. Let's get down to basics, boy. If you don't ante up, you won't get any Thanksgiving dinner, and nobody will play Monopoly with you for a full week. Conrad's eyes got large and his forehead wrinkled as he let go of the train's engine, and Grandma placed it in the gift box with our other contributions. U.S. officials drop plans to prosecute agitators at school. Won't press action against mob leaders. Arkansas Gazette, Thursday, November 21st, 1957. Based on an assurance by local authorities that they would maintain order, the federal government announced it would back off and not even prosecute segregationist mob leaders. The segregationist leaders were celebrating their victories, and the students at school were letting us know about their triumph. And even as our problems with segregationists multiplied yet again, Minnie Jean focused on her audition for the Glee Club and Christmas show. She had worked herself up into a real dither. Time and time again, Melba and I had tried to talk her out of participating, but she wouldn't listen. Moments before the tryouts got underway, I stood in the doorway of the auditorium, nervously wringing my hands as Minnie Jean tried to register. Mrs. Huckabee wore a pleasant smile as she explained to Minnie Jean that the day to register for the tryouts had long since passed, and they couldn't violate the rules for her. We knew at once that she had been tricked. Had school officials been sincere about offering Minnie Jean the opportunity, they would have been clear about the terms for participating. Blinking back tears, Minnie Jean turned to us, then walked away. Thelma and I trailed behind, trying our best to console her. On Monday, November 25th, I prepared myself to speak to 250 students gathered for Central High's early morning chapel service. As I walked toward the front of the room and faced those white students all staring at me, my knees felt weak and the back of my neck was tight. I stood at a podium in a room filled with people who didn't relish my speaking to them. Taking a deep breath, I began the talk I had practiced in front of the mirror and in front of Grandma and Mama. The light from the window at the back of the room was my focus. Mother Lois had said never to look any single member of the audience in the eye when you're speaking. At first, I garbled some of the words, and then, as I remembered Grandma India's advice, I calmed down. She had said, "God speaking. You're merely the instrument he chooses at this time. God is a wonderful speaker, so you have absolutely nothing to be nervous about." I didn't speak about integration or say things about us or them. I just talked about God and how he cares for each of us. At first, I could tell by the students' expressions that they didn't like what I was saying. Some frowned while others contorted their faces to show their contempt. Many had perfectly blank looks, but a few listened intently and nodded their heads in agreement. Afterward, 2 people came up to congratulate me and ask why I had a northern accent and used such correct English. Northern accent? Did they really ask you about that? Mother Lois grinned as I described my speaking. You tell them your mama's an English teacher, and in this house we speak only the King's English. We were discussing my day, sitting in our robes at the dining room table after dinner and baths, playing Monopoly. The house was festive, and we were surrounded by the aroma of minced meat and sweet potato pies cooking in the oven. Any flying objects? Actually, some of them were very nice. You were right, Grandma. She didn't look up. She was preoccupied with examining her next move on the board. We were already resigned to the fact that she would skunk us all once again. Right? How so? She mumbled, not taking her attention off the game for even one instant. Well, for just that moment, I felt we had something in common, our love of the Lord. I think they felt it too, because some of them smiled and spoke to me. Someday, they'll have the courage to be nice to you outside that room of worship. I don't think so, Grandma, because they would have to take so much criticism from their friends and families. This year is different. It won't always be this way. She rolled the dice, bought the last available property, and once again we'd all been trounced by our sweet Grandma, the Monopoly champ. When Mrs. Bates telephoned to say the 9 of us would be gathering for an official Thanksgiving dinner to be held at her house Tuesday evening before the holiday, she mentioned that there would be a news conference. I cringed at the thought. Whenever there was special press coverage on us, the abuse we later suffered at Central was in direct proportion to the size and quality of the story printed or aired. When Mother and I arrived at Mrs. Bates's home for the Thanksgiving dinner, I knew even more people than usual were there because we couldn't find a place to park. When I entered the spacious living room, there was standing room only. I had never seen so many people, most of them reporters, squeezed into that space under hot, glaring lights. At the center of the room, some of the other 9 students, dressed in Sunday best, were sitting at a table set with the same care Grandma used on holidays. Linen and lace and silver and a beautifully prepared bird. Mrs. Bates directed me to a seat, and I squeezed past Jeff and Gloria to get to my place. Even more reporters with more cameras and equipment packed into the room as we tried to give the impression of having a normal meal. Some of the others were reviewing speeches they had prepared. I hadn't prepared anything, because by now the art of giving an interview was second nature, or at least that's what I thought. Once the cameras were rolling and the microphones recording, the questions began to fly. When Mrs. Bates asked, "Do you kids want white meat or dark meat?" I spoke without thinking, "This is an integrated turkey." The annoyed expression on her face matched the one on Mother's, letting me know that maybe I should have prepared a speech. The reporters began snickering as they posed a series of questions on turkeys and integration, calling on me by name to answer. My palms began sweating and my mouth turned dry. I hadn't meant to put my foot in my mouth. I didn't want the others to think I was trying to steal the spotlight, but once I had spoken out of turn, integrated turkey became the theme. "You'll live to regret that statement, Melba," Mother said as we were driving home. I knew she was agonizing over the consequences of my frivolity. She was right. I would suffer. There came a day just before Thanksgiving break when Danny broke the rules again and came close up to talk to me. He wouldn't say whether or not he was leaving for good, but he behaved in a strange way, saying over and over again, "Take care of yourself, you hear me? Don't bend over to pick up any books or walk in dark corners." He winked and smiled as he backed away, giving me a military salute. I stood frozen in my tracks, holding back the tears. Over and over again, I asked him if he were going away for good, but he wouldn't tell me. "Just mind your P's and Q's." He turned on his heels. I couldn't admit to myself it was really true. I turned away and ran in the opposite direction, never looking back, never turning to let him see the tears in my eyes. From that moment on, whenever I thought about Danny and the 101st being gone for good, I pushed the idea out of my mind because I couldn't bear to deal with it. I just had to pretend it wasn't so, even though some part of me kept saying I truly had to fend for myself now. My real Thanksgiving at home was a special day of peace and joy. It was wonderful being with all my relatives, and I was able to convince them not to talk about Central High. For just that day, I felt normal, and I hoped that my life could be that way soon. I came face to face with reality later that evening as I read the Gazette headlines. Last of 225 GIs leave school. Arkansas National Guard in charge. Thanksgiving night, I wrote in my diary, "Danny and the others have truly gone. He didn't even say goodbye. I will always remember this man. How could I forget his name? I will never know if he only behaved that kindly because he was a great soldier or a good person or both. It doesn't matter. He was wonderful. I want to remember the names of the other nice 101st soldiers as well. Jody, Marty, Mex, and Goggles. I wish Danny had told me he was leaving forever, although I don't know how I could have thanked him in words. I might have cried, and he wouldn't have liked that. I never thought I would have tears in my eyes over some white man. I don't think I'll ever see him again. Thank you, Danny." 9 Negroes begin 12th week at CHS with no incidents. Arkansas Gazette, Tuesday, December 3rd, 1957. We wondered how the Gazette editors had come to that conclusion, since they didn't have anyone inside the school. They were like so many of the adults around us, content to pretend that all was well as we began classes at Central High on December 2nd. But we knew better. Our day-to-day experience showed us that the situation was worsening. "Do all niggers eat integrated turkeys?" one boy shouted, putting his foot out to trip me in the hallway on the way to my first class. "Whoops," I said as I stepped on his foot hard. "Oh, excuse me." I grinned. His face reddened. The subject of turkey was brought up many more times by the end of the day, and not in a friendly fashion. The only thing that kept me going was counting the days until Christmas vacation.